Thank you very much for joining us today at Alliant Group for a webinar here. I think we're going to just take about 30 minutes of your time here to talk about what's going on in tax and businesses. I'm Dean Zerbe, and more importantly is Rick Lazio. Congressman Lazio is joining me as well too, and he's got his finger on the pulse on everything that's happening in Washington. So we're going to try to give you a brief overview of what has happened. More importantly, give you a sense of what is happening and about to happen on taxes as well as really kind of broadly economically. If you have any questions, we've got the chat box there. Feel free to send us a question. If we don't get to it now, we'll get to it, afterwards. We'll certainly reach out to you, and that kind of goes on throughout. If you've got a question tomorrow, the next day, just feel free to reach out to us, Alliant Group. We're happy to help you here on all that. So, just kind of a disclaimer there. As you can see, everything's moving so fast that we're doing the best we can to give you up to the minute on what's happening, but obviously things change. This is probably the first slide, and Rick, I know you and I have talked about this, is they finally have kind of settled on what they're going to do on the tax extensions. Do you want to take us through that, Rick, about where we are now?
Well, the Treasury has now announced, and I think most people on the call probably know this, that the federal income tax filing due date has been automatically extended. I say automatically because it's not going to require any kind of filing from April 15th to July 15th. And there's a series of other changes, including quarterly date due dates. One thing to keep in mind, Dean, is that the June 15th quarterly has not yet been changed. So even though the April 15th quarterly has been kicked to July, the June 15th quarterly has not yet been moved. Now that may change, but that has not been announced so far by Treasury. Individuals. At one point, there was a income limitation on up to $1 million in tax liability and $10 million for C corps in order to qualify for the extension and to not pay any penalties. Those thresholds, those caps now have been waived. They're out, and so it's any individual and any business, including C corp, will automatically have the ability to extend until July 15th. One thing I would also say is there's some question around if you feel like you need more time beyond July 15th. Some people have asked, do I need to file for an extension? And while it's not clear, there are many people who would advise, yes, file if you think you're going to be beyond July 15th. But that specific guidance has not come out yet from Treasury or the service.
Right. And then coupled with that, the states seem to be kind of bit by bit. Every day we get new announcements one way or the other about the states trying to follow in line, although Virginia today said they were staying with their deadlines. But in general, I see most of the states are pushing theirs to kind of get in line with the feds. And we'll be having on our Alliant Group website up-to-date information on that. And AICPA also, for those not familiar, I think been doing a nice job of trying to keep up to date on where those deadlines are too. But Rick, any perspective on that side of it?
No, but just to state the obvious that we're going to be focusing on federal guidelines, dates, provisions, but people need to check in. CPAs need to check in with their state. Companies need to speak with their advisors, their tax advisors, and they need to be aware of what the states are doing and not just presume that they are piggybacking on the Fed. There are states that have some quirks and have different dates. I think most states, as you said, Dean, are trying to make it easy for taxpayers by piggybacking on what the feds are doing. But the wiser course is to check and not to presume.
So the way we think of the legislation in Washington is we have this phase one, phase two. We kind of tend to think of Bill 1, Bill 2, Bill 3. So Bill 1, I think folks are pretty familiar with. That was the first thing that was passed out of the box just to get something out the door. and you see it there. And Rick will talk a bit about SBA in general, what they're doing. And then phase two, Rick, I didn't know if there's anything you want to say on phase one, on Bill 1.
No, I mean, primarily, this was the initial effort, early passed and signed into law in early March, $8.3 billion in emergency spending, basically for public health system. So this was something that was really meant to address some systemic needs, some money going into furthering research, and some money going into basically the healthcare system, and some other provisions that allow, for example, Medicare beneficiaries to use telemedicine. But most of this was not related to business specifically,
right,
or was not tax oriented.
Right. So then we got into Bill 2 as we think of it. And again, I think folks are mostly familiar with it. This did now start to get into the employee and employer side, and getting into that work there. And you had kind of dealing with really the spot of 500 employees or fewer. The Secretary of Labor can, I guess, allow for employers, I beg your pardon, with 50 employees or less, they can waive this, is my understanding. I haven't heard whether they're going to do that or not. I thought it was a given they were going to do it, but I'm not so sure on that. Rick, you may know, but you can see here the provisions. It's certainly, those who've heard me speak in the past, I always look at, well, how much did this cost, to see the kind of the proof in the pudding. This is $104 billion in tax credits that they're putting out there, basically to give credits to employers that have to provide, again, it's 500 fewer, sick and family leave. It's kind of a little bit of different groups of folks hit. I don't know, Rick, if you want to just quickly give them a sense of the different categories and the different folks that they're trying to take care of here.
Yeah, I mean, among the highlights, Dean, would be a new paid sick leave for workers. It would provide that if you have coronavirus-related reasons, the employees would receive up to 80 hours of paid sick leave, and that would be reimbursed for up to 100% reimbursement for paid leave up to 10 days. Employers would face no payroll tax liability. They would receive a tax credit. The idea is to get this out very, very quickly. You mentioned small business or employers with fewer than 50 employees. They potentially could exempt themselves from the requirements to provide leave, but they have to establish that the viability of the business is threatened in order for them to opt out. And then there's a separate paid child care leave credit that would be for employees and employers. The provision for the child care credit, you'd have to be taking care of a child who's out of school because of the coronavirus. But in that case, it would be for fewer than 500 employees. Those companies would be eligible, and eligible employers would be able to claim a refundable credit based on the qualifying leave that they have between the effective date of the bill and December 31st. So these things run until the end of this year. And as I mentioned, so there's two. There's the one provision that deals with just individuals who cannot work because of the coronavirus, not because they have it, but because the business is closed. They would be eligible for up to 10 days of paid, 100% paid leave. And then for people that are taking care of a child, they are eligible for up to an additional 10 weeks of expanded paid family and medical leave at 2/3 of the employee's pay.
Right, and I view these were capped at $200 per day on the second part that you mentioned, and $511 per day on the kind of the 2-week period where you're sick or what have you. Is my
correct?
understanding. Yeah.
That's correct. And the child care provision is capped at $200 per day or $10,000 in the aggregate.
Right. So let's then now turn to kind of probably what everyone's on the call listening about. And Rick, this is kind of the phase 3 or Bill 3. And the way when I talk to the Hill, they're thinking about this is really it's Bill 3, the tax, kind of this more expansive tax relief focusing on families and businesses. And then really the appropriations too is kind of what are we going to do on the appropriation side, on the spending side on two. So it's really almost two bills combined. In part, my sense is that the senators do not want to hang out in their gym anymore. They're all coming down and getting sick. But the idea is the Congress wants to, in a sense, get its work done, get it all done, and then break for 8 weeks or so, kind of gotten the plate cleaned and get back to their own districts is rough and ready what I'm hearing. And then, but Rick, why don't you, I don't know if that jives with you, but really just give us your handicapping on this bill getting passed here in the next 24 hours.
Yeah, Dean, you're spot on in your analysis of where we are right now. This is, somewhere around a $1.7 trillion rescue bill right now. And just to put that into context, that's more than the Congress appropriates for an entire fiscal year. So it is a massive, massive tax and spending bill that is meant to provide, assurances, liquidity, guarantees for business, direct help for individuals to ensure that people get through the next few weeks until we find a health care related bridge. One of the individual provisions that you mentioned was, looks like right now it's a rebate or a refundable tax credit of up to $1,200. Now that may grow a little bit more before the bill actually gets taken up in the Senate and hopefully in the House and to the president's desk. But that tax credit would be up to $1,200 for individuals and twice that of $2,400 for individuals filing a joint return, subject to phase outs. And that phase out may change, but at one point it was $75,000 for individuals, $150 for joint returns. And from what I am hearing from members who are negotiating this bill in Congress, as of today, they were optimistic that we would get an agreement. Members seem on both sides to be somewhat frustrated, but are grudgingly moving toward an agreement because they understand how time sensitive this is, and that we are likely to see that announced sometime tonight, and with a bill hopefully either voted on late tonight or sometime early tomorrow.
Rick, I think that's we're in sync on that. So I think there's a good feeling about that. Rick, talk a little bit. It's not on this slide here, but what the Fed is doing and how the Fed's responding and how that impacts our listeners.
Yeah, it's important to understand that there are two issues that the country is facing right now. One is a solvency issue. And by that, we mean, look, does the company have the wherewithal to be able to survive given the change in business dynamics? And the second issue is a liquidity issue. Do I have enough cash, enough money, if I would otherwise be solvent to get me through this what we hope is a temporary rough patch? What the Federal Reserve is doing now is trying to address that second issue by inserting liquidity into the market. And it's doing it in a couple of different ways. They have a number of different places that they can inject this liquidity through banks to get money out the door, buying mortgage-backed securities, buying asset-backed securities. All these things are keeping interest rates lower than they would ordinarily be in a credit crunch. And so they're going to be, this is going to be a historic amount of buybacks. And then there's also a program that will provide lending directly. Now, this is something that they don't have an infrastructure for, but potentially a loan working with Treasury to both larger businesses and small businesses. So this would be extending debt. And this is, again, novel. There's no form or playbook for it, but the plan is for the Fed to step in and to play a role in injecting liquidity both indirectly through the banking system and directly to industry players.
Good. Well, thank you for that. Really informative. So, and obviously there's other spending provisions, a lot of money coming to the hospitals, looking at the direct funding for different industries. So all those things are coming through. Let's talk about the tax provisions. So the Senate Finance Committee, my old shop, Senator Grassley, put forward their bill, and that still, I would say, kind of remains rough and ready, the tent pole of what's going on in the taxes. Some things that will not be in there is the delay of the estimated tax payments and the other provisions like that. Those have all been put aside because of Treasury's actions that we talked about earlier, that they're taking their own authority and delaying it, so the Congress is staying out of that. I think one of the biggest ones, we certainly talked to the Hill about this, and I heard a lot from you all. As you know, sometime earlier they were talking about giving a payroll holiday. They didn't do that, but what they've done is a very aggressive delay on payments of payrolls, basically essentially allowing folks to delay for the remainder of 2020 and defer it without with the first 50% due on December 31st, 2021, and then the remainder due on December 31st, 2022. A big change that they've gotten in there too is that the folks responsible for the payroll tax will no longer be personally responsible. There's the trust fund penalties. Obviously, the company still owes it and they cover to that, but you're not going to see where we've seen in the past where they really will thump on the person that's responsible, even criminally. And Rick, I know you're familiar with that too. I think that's going to give a lot of peace of mind to folks in this area.
Yes, for sure. There are a number of companies who express some concern about, over aggressive prosecution, and the federal government wants people to take up these programs, and so they're trying to make it as easy as possible. And I say that in quotes, but as easy as possible to allow these companies to take advantage of the programs. One thing I would say, Dean, about this is so important, the payroll tax deferral, because under the current law right now, nothing that's happened before would negate the fact that the March 31st payroll taxes would be due, and the penalties are still, potentially, enforced.
Right.
So if this doesn't pass for some reason, people need to be mindful of the fact that they still have payroll taxes due. I'm confident this is going to pass, but just something to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a big number. And the NOLs will be in. They will have the NOLs. It'll be for 18, 19, and 20, allowing a 5-year NOL carryback for losses incurred in tax years 18, 19, and 20. And also for taxable years prior to 2021, taxpayer would be permitted to deduct 100% of loss carry forwards and carrybacks. And they're still trying to tweak it to make sure, again, that these rules work and that people take them. I had an interesting insight from Treasury, Rick, that in a sense, Treasury outlook is just we're in a 0% interest rate world right now. So maybe in the past they were worried about time value of money, but they just don't care about that. I mean, obviously there's the whole economic disaster, but kind of philosophically where they are is just, hey, it doesn't, we want people to take all these credits and send, the NOLs and what have you now to free up and get their cash into their hands. We're not really worried about the fact that we want to see the monies back in the Treasury down the road because we are in this 0% interest environment. So I thought that was kind of an interesting window into their thinking on it. So the loss limitations for non-corporate taxpayers, they're going to delay the applicability of that section. Interest limitation, they're basically modifying the section 163J interest limitation in two respects. the limitation would be increased to 50% rather than 30% of adjustable taxable income for taxable years beginning in both 19 and 20. And two, for taxable years beginning in 2020, the taxpayer would be able to determine its limitation by using its ATI from 2019 rather than 2020. They're doing some modifications to make sure that people that are getting loans from the government or accepting other loans won't be bollocked by this. So you're going to see them loosening this up even more to make it more workable for folks on that. The AMT, the bill would accelerate the use of AMT credits. It'll be in with modifications to allow refundable credits to be applied to both 18 and 19 tax years, as opposed to just 2018 tax year in the earlier Grassley bill, with elections to take entire refundable credit amount in 2018, and to provide that any application for refund of an amount pursuant to such election is subject to Section 6411, quote, quickie refund provisions with no JCT review. So again, you can see them as they're kind of going forward, as they're modifying it, they're trying to make it work better for folks on it. There's a number of technical corrections. I would say I know a lot of you, the restaurant provision is near and dear. Rick, you may have a better understanding than I do, but the latest I heard is, even though it was in the Grassley bill, that is still a fight between the House and the Senate on that provision.
Yes, no, Dean, absolutely right. This is the leasehold provision that lots of people in the retail sector are very focused on. It was a drafting error in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There's been numerous efforts to try and address that through a technical corrections. It is in the base Senate bill, but it is a bone of contention for House Democrats and most Senate Democrats as well. And of course, you've probably heard the news that there is a battle over what would be viewed as extraneous. Now, you may not view this as extraneous, but extraneous provisions, solar panel provisions, and what have you. I think right now they're trying to talk through how to cleanse the bill of the issues that could slow it up, so that we can get this money flowing as quickly as possible and give guidance to businesses and to workers as quickly as possible.
So so that gives you kind of a run up on the bill overall, and the business provisions. There's and we'll obviously post as soon as we have anything definitive on the final. But that gives you, I think, the general architecture, the big provisions that are in there. I wanted to just talk, when Rick and I are talking to you all, your CPAs and your business partners, a lot of groups hearing overwhelmingly that the need is to get immediate cash. And I think obviously the payroll delay is essentially a way to do that. It's about a $732 billion provision of delay. I think Marty Sullivan was writing in tax notes today, just to give you a sense of how huge that is to get that delay. But that's just, of course, one thing out there. And Rick, you already talked about the Federal Reserve, but the SBA loans and the NOL carrybacks. I mean, all these, maybe you can talk about a little bit, all these are ways that the Congress is overwhelmingly focused to try to get cash immediately into people's hands.
Yeah, no, so, keeping in mind that we're trying to get cash into people's hands so they can survive, but also that they can spend and support some of the businesses that are operating. And second of all, we want to make sure that those businesses are solvent and have the liquidity to survive so they can employ people. So it's a two-pronged approach. Again, solvency and liquidity, building confidence, making sure that we're investing in the healthcare infrastructure and making these what we hope will be inoculations available for free as soon as possible, although I think we are many months off from that. There's, a pause on student loans that people ought to be aware of. There's, a number of different provisions around foreclosure prevention that being implemented somewhat by banks and by the secondary market, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So there's a lot going on. And as you had mentioned, these couple of loan programs, there's one for larger businesses, but there's one also earmarked for smaller businesses to provide loans via the SBA program, but they're streamlining the program so that it is not as cumbersome as it traditionally has been. The banks themselves that are SBA lenders will be the ones who will be administering these loans. And again, they're trying to streamline this application process so it's quick and the liquidity is made available within weeks.
Right. Yes. And we're I see a few questions here we'll get to in a second. And I think one thing too, and you see it there, we got the SBA loans, and you went to that. The other one I just would mention is obviously we see it firsthand here at Alliant Group is that we've been able already in this filing season to get hundreds of millions of dollars back into the hands of our clients and our CPA partners' clients through the R&D credit and other credits and incentives out there. So I would strongly encourage you to be looking at that. Again, it's been a godsend for some of these companies that just as they're kind of hitting this wall with the coronavirus, we've been able to get them the credits and incentives and qualifying for that they need, and that's turned into cash in hand immediately too. So just have that very much in mind too as you're going forward, and happy to talk to those who are familiar with it to talk about that more. Dean, just on that, if I can, just on that, because I just have been talking to businesses over the last several days, lots of businesses, and they are so focused, hyper focused as they should be on liquidity, that getting a cash infusion via the R&D credit, or for startup companies, the startup credit, could help them offset quarterly tax liability, could help them in the case of a startup company offset payroll tax liability that eventually they're going to have to pay. So this is a no-brainer. It should be a chip shot for a company that has eligible activity to go and access what could be a very significant support for the next several months to get them through this crisis. It's highly, highly recommended. Yeah, well said. Yeah. And so I've gotten a number of questions here. Some of these are pretty technical, and we'll get back to you on them. But there was one about a question about, well, if you're voluntarily quarantining because you think you've come in contact, are you eligible for the paid benefits? My understanding, Rick, this goes back to the kind of phase 2 bill and the payments. My understanding is that is correct. If you personally work for a small, under 500 person business, and you're having to quarantine yourself, that would be encompassed by the bill. Is that your understanding, Rick?
Yeah. Self quarantine is a eligible factor for qualifying for these credits for the paid leave.
Yeah.
And by the way,
go ahead.
Well, just one quick other thing that most people may not know, but the self-employed are also eligible for some of this assistance. So we're talking a lot about small and mid-sized businesses, which are very focused on given the size of the employment force that they employ, and big businesses, but the self-employed also will find that they get support in this bill.
Yeah, I think that's critical because of they're unable to get into the unemployment line for unemployment benefits, rather. That's just vital for them to take a look at. So and do that. We'll get to a couple of other questions. I wanted to give you just a quick point about the IRS and all this. Before we got on this call, I was able to talk to, as you know, we have two former commissioners, Mark Everson and Steve Miller, and Kathy Petronchik, who was the former commissioner for small business and self-employed at the IRS. So really a wealth of knowledge at the IRS. And I asked them, how's this all going to work for the IRS, and what should we be telling our CPA partners and what have you? And obviously, I think in general, they think the IRS is going to be able to manage this. They've got playbooks that they've done, because they're going to have checks in the air. But of course, they're still trying to get through the tax reform bill. Now they've got all those new provisions, plus they're going to have to issue checks, and it's all happening in the middle of the filing season. So I don't mean to break out the violin for the IRS. Everyone's got enormous difficulties right now, but it's obviously challenging for them. And of course, they have a workforce that's working from home. They're having to deal with coronavirus just like we're all employers, employees, and what have you. But they felt that they would be able to do it, that it would be difficult, though, in terms of managing call sites, filing, all that. It's going to kind of bring things down to a slower pace. And certainly the more dramatic deadlines that folks are thinking of when they're going to get checks probably aren't going to be met. And an additional challenge for them is that it's not like they're issuing checks just to people that file and that they've got in their returns. They're trying to capture, and I get why Congress wants to do it and broaden the people being helped, particularly folks with very, very low income or no income. But you can imagine that's also a little bit of an eye blink for the IRS to do it. But all that said, I think they'll get it done. It's not going to be pretty, and it's going to mean delays on kind of regular things and regular activities and what have you. I talked to them about what are you doing with folks who are on audit and exam, and obviously we defend a lot of people. It's one of the services we provide. What Kathy Petronchik told me, she found that the IRS had been very accommodating in terms of delaying or saying, hey, we need to push back on giving you this or getting this material, be it an audit exam or a collection. And Steve Miller brought up even the idea of IRS bringing back the idea of a fresh start that they did back in the 2008-9 recession. So I think what we're seeing and what they're expecting is a service that is more responsive and trying to be accommodating of people. But you need to raise your hand and talk to them. But Rick, I don't know if you had anything you want to add or other impressions you had on that conversation.
No, I think you've correctly you sort of characterized that conversation. I thought that what I had heard is that there was some confidence level that refunds would still be able to go out, at a reasonable time. So individuals 7 to 10 days, maybe more like 21 days for businesses. But if that slips, I wouldn't be surprised that the IT systems are, were strained beforehand, and this will strain them further yet. And they're asked to do some things here that they've never done before.
Right.
So they're quality people overwhelmingly, and they will rise to the occasion. But they're going to struggle to be able to meet all these demands in this pressure cooker environment.
Yeah. Just a couple of other questions. I don't think I answered this one. But I think you did, Rick, earlier. But someone asked, what about the payroll filing due 4/30/20? I think Congress has that very much in mind. I think they're going to try to pass this, and the effective date will be immediate. So I think the idea is to deal with that filing. The 4/30/20 is my sense, Rick, of what they'll be doing on the payroll delays.
Yeah, I expect that to happen as well. But again, people should be mindful of the fact that right now, until that bill gets signed into law, the due dates for payroll taxes and the corresponding penalties are all in effect.
Right. And then one last question. Any chance the R&D credit could be allowed to reduce payroll tax for more mature companies? Right now, we do have a payroll R&D credit for startups, and we're actually in the next phase looking at maybe expanding that to make it more available for that. That's an interesting idea to allow for payroll tax for bigger companies. I think there is a lot of thought of different ideas that are out there. I don't think that's kind of been readily discussed now, and it's certainly not in the bill before us. But regardless, as Rick said, the R&D credit can be an enormous benefit for folks in terms of the reduced taxes. Rick, I think that kind of takes us, we're a little bit over the half hour, I promised. Here's our emails for folks to have, and feel free to send us questions. We'll get back to the ones that we didn't get to, and I apologize for that. But thank you very much for being here with us, and we'll try to continue to keep you updated. And Rick,
Dean,
go ahead and give us.
Just one thing I just want to mention. I guess we have a typo on my email. It should be rick.lazio, so a dot between the K and the L. Otherwise, correct.
Okay. All right, great. Rick, let me let you finish this up and give the last word to our audience today.
No, I just want to thank you, Dean. I know you've been in the middle of this, speaking with your former colleagues on Senate Finance and Ways and Means, and our effort is to make sure that we're a resource about breaking information, late breaking information, and to give you insights so that you can plan accordingly. We're one email or phone call away, and we're absolutely committed to making sure that you service your clients, or if you're a business, that you support your employees by keeping them employed, and that we do everything we can to get you the dollars that you need to see you through this crisis.
Thanks so much. All have a wonderful afternoon. Cheers.